When the Second World War ended, hundreds of thousands of traumatized Holocaust survivors found themselves in European displaced persons camps. The universal assumption was that these cramped quarters were designed as sanctuaries, safe havens where exhausted people could finally heal and figure out their next steps. The standard historical narrative usually offers a very simple explanation for what happened next. It claims that these European Jews universally and desperately wanted to emigrate to Palestine. But the reality on the ground was different. Many survivors wanted nothing more than a quiet moment of peace. They actively resisted uprooting themselves all over again to move to an active conflict zone. An underground campaign was operating right beneath the surface. Zionist cadres deliberately infiltrated the very camps set up to house these refugees. Their secret mission was to funnel these vulnerable people into Palestine, regardless of what the refugees themselves actually wanted. For many, the transition to these camps didn't lead to a period of rebuilding, but to a new series of pressures from organizers who saw the refugees as strategic assets. To understand how this happened, we have to look at the ideology driving the movement. In 1944, Zionist leader and future Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion stated bluntly that the essence of Zionism was a populating endeavor, a mission to fill the land with multitudes of Jews. This directive created a specific way of viewing survivors. According to Israeli professor Yosef Grodzinski, Zionist organizers working in Europe were explicitly searching for what they called good human material. The organizers knew they faced a massive logistical hurdle. When people are living comfortable, stable lives, they rarely volunteer to move to a war zone. Post-Holocaust displaced persons, however, had lost everything. That desperation made them a perfect captive target for recruitment. When attempts to persuade these refugees failed, the infiltrators systematically stripped away their autonomy. If a camp resident refused to go along with the plan, operatives confiscated vital food rations, fired them from their camp jobs, or evicted them from their dwellings. By weaponizing the basic requirements for survival, these operatives successfully transformed traumatized, exhausted individuals into a massive human reserve of immigration potential. This campaign reached deeply into Europe's youth. The Jewish Brigade of the British Army, created in the final months of the war, took on a clandestine mission to track down Jewish children who had been hidden with Christian families or placed in monasteries during the Holocaust. Many of these adoptive families had saved the children out of sheer goodness and were raising them as their own. When future Israeli Major General Yossi Peled was a child living with his adoptive Christian family in Belgium, brigade soldiers entered the home armed with weapons. They threatened his adoptive parents and forced them to hand the children over. The extraction was devastating. One of Peled's sisters later recalled the terror of that day, noting that her brother's screams still echo in her head. Once taken, these children were placed in orphanages, like the well-known Salvino House, where they faced strict conditioning. They were forced to speak only Hebrew, and they were forbidden from leaving the orphanage to search for any living relatives in Europe. Finding a living aunt or uncle might have meant staying in Europe. By suppressing biological ties and human bonds, the organizers ensured these children would become the next generation of immigrants for the new state. This manipulation of human life extended to the highest political levels. While the 1960 Hollywood movie romanticized the ship called the Exodus, the 1947 reality for the 4,500 survivors on board was bleak. When British authorities refused to allow the ship into Palestine, the French government stepped in and agreed to offer the refugees humanitarian asylum. But David Ben-Gurion rejected this solution, forcing the survivors to languish on board the ship for 7 agonizing months. He prolonged their suffering for a specific strategic reason. Dramatizing the fate of these refugees created a massive orchestrated PR spectacle. It generated worldwide sympathy, which Ben-Gurion then used to claim financial reparations from the Federal Republic of Germany. This chart shows exactly why the tactics escalated as war in Palestine became imminent. When operatives ran a voluntary recruitment drive among the DP camp residents, they netted less than 0.3% of the population. Faced with this near-total rejection, leaders implemented a mandatory military draft on these stateless refugees. The enforcement of this compulsory draft was violent. operatives published blacklists and physically beat draft evaders. They even targeted their elderly parents. In one camp, the father of a draft evader named Wecker was brutally beaten. In another, an old man named Richter Isaac was attacked simply because his son Moshe refused to register. Those who couldn't escape the draft faced a grim reality on the battlefield. They were thrown into combat units with minimal training, paid less than Western volunteers, and often couldn't even understand the Hebrew orders being shouted at them. Many died completely alone. The weakest, most vulnerable victims of the Holocaust were systematically forced to become frontline fodder for a war they never chose to fight. A massive, highly coercive operation like this requires serious backing. It was meticulously hidden from the public eye, bankrolled by $25 million in funding from the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. The veil almost slipped when British General Sir Frederick Morgan noticed that many of the arriving refugees were well-dressed, with pockets bulging with money. He publicly stated that a secret force was orchestrating a mass exodus to Palestine, but his analysis didn't last long in the press. Immense political pressure from pro-Israel groups quickly forced Morgan into silence, ultimately compelling him to issue a formal public retraction of his statements. There is a deep friction between the textbook image of a post-war sanctuary and the documented historical records of kidnappings, blacklists, and forced military conscription. True historical understanding requires us to look past manufactured myths. We have to recognize the tragedy of vulnerable survivors being stripped of their agency, reduced from human beings seeking peace into mere tactical assets for a political objective.